Hi, I'm Othais, and this is the Browning's patent automatic Colt pistol, later known retroactively by collectors as the Model 1900, and it's going to begin a long and interesting story on our channel. But for now, let's get it into the lightbox. Being an early automatic, it's not surprising that this weighs just shy of 2.2 pounds. However, that 9-inch length is a little remarkable. It has a detachable single-stack box magazine. It has room for 7 rounds of the .38 automatic Colt pistol cartridge, a new piece of ammunition developed specifically for this gun. This episode and the others that will follow along into the history of the Colt 1911 are being made possible by a generous loan from our friends at Manticore Arms. Thanks to them, we now finally have most of what we need, so pop by and say thank you. Also, if you happen to have access to, say, a later prototype like the 1909 or 1910, please let us know. Now, I'm very happy to say that this episode is the first of what is going to be a series that ultimately leads to the development and adoption of the venerated Colt 1911 pistol. However, in order to get there, we're going to see in detail that good designs come from repeated trial and error with many failed iterations along the way. This incredible gun included. But first, a little context, and we'll generally start things off setting ourselves in the year of 1896. At this time, the centerfire double-action revolver was standard issue for just about every army on the globe. Thanks to our efforts in other episodes, you may know just how much effort went into even getting this far. However, revolvers have some inherent disadvantages, which were slowly being overcome through the use of several advancing technologies. First up was the development of a truly automatic machine gun, a firearm that ejected a spent cartridge and fed the next all under its own power. These began as massive pieces of equipment, more akin to artillery than simple firearms, but they soon began to shrink down. It actually wasn't long before inventors were attempting their own handheld automatic rifles and pistols, but the early designs were generally weak and prone to fouling and jamming. The situation had improved, however, with the introduction of 2 pieces of ammunition technology. First, the jacketed bullet, which helped keep the soft lead necessary for on-target performance from being shattered when used in small-bore, high-speed rifles. Jacketing bullets also made them firmer and more consistent and reliable to sort of maneuver and feed through a mechanical system. Around the same time, the French introduced smokeless gunpowder, which is number 2 on our ammo advancement list of 2. This was first used in their magazine rifle of 1886, which kicked off a worldwide arms race thanks to its fast-moving bullet, providing extremely long-range accuracy without throwing up clouds of smoke or fouling the action with unburnt powder. Now, technically, any sort of shooting builds up residue, but smokeless powder was far, far cleaner than the old black powder cartridges, and it made the task of miniaturizing something like a machine gun exceptionally easier, as you didn't need massive tolerances in order to account for all that fouling, or some sort of secondary mechanism to blow it out. With all these technologies in place, plus some more in the way of steel and spring improvements, we see a number of automatic designs start to emerge in the mid-1890s. Borchardt, Mauser, Bergmann, and others would begin piecing together automatic pistols. These were just powerful and reliable enough to make military officials curious. However, adoption, and especially perfection, were usually still well out of reach. Presently, the revolver was still king, and it was in this sort of environment, specifically around 1894 to 1896, into which walked one already respectable inventor, John Moses Browning. Born January 23rd of 1855 in then very rural Ogden, Utah, he was the son of a pioneer gunsmith and was raised repairing every sort of frontier firearm that anyone managed to drag out into the wilderness and break. His experience would drive him to design his own improvements and then his own ground-up single-shot rifle. The resulting work of art was discovered by and sold to Winchester Repeating Arms, and began a very lucrative relationship, with the bulk of Winchester's line, and just about all their most famous guns, being invented by John Moses Browning. Who was not, by the way, the only Browning, not by a long shot, because his father had joined the Mormon faith. John Moses and his brother Matthew were actually products of their father's second marriage, and a third very relevant brother, Jonathan Edmund Browning, was from the third marriage. While there are still plenty of other Browning siblings scattered about, these are the three we concern ourselves with today. John Moses conceived of ideas, Ed, as he was called, put them into metal, and Matt ran the business proper, taking care of the books and contracts. Now from here the story actually gets much wider, but we only care about a certain sliver of the Browning's life, so let's skip ahead a little bit. During the late 1880s, John Browning had become interested in using the excess gas expelled from the muzzle of a rifle in order to operate some sort of action automatically. This research path led him to develop his own machine gun. Initially a crude device in appearance, it nonetheless ran almost without fault, faster and more effective than the Gatling gun, and far, far more portable. This type of weapon, however, was of little interest to Winchester, and so the brothers took it to Colt's Patent Firearms in 1890. Now, we've already begun exploring the history of Samuel Colt's factory with our Patterson and Walker episodes, and we'll continue to go further soon. In the meantime, however, let's fill in some gaps. Samuel Colt the man would pass away in 1862, and just 2 years later, the Colt factory would be burned horribly. Operating at a fraction of their previous capacity, the business would be saved by the efforts of widow Elizabeth Colt and her brother Richard Jarvis. While they took care of running the company as a whole, neither was actually an arms maker by previous trade, meaning they had to rely on the management below them and superintendents for actual product development and manufacture. The result was a sort of oscillating atmosphere where invention could either be embraced or shunned depending on the year, or the market, or the people involved. Into this sort of fray stepped John Henry Hall, who had been a bright and ambitious businessman with experience overseeing manufacturing. He started as general manager and treasurer in 1888 and would gain more influence from there, eventually rising to VP. Hall would push hard for modernization at Colt's, including an 1898 all-out demand for $75,000 to invest in factory improvements, particularly a better power plant and more automated machinery. Battling the more conservative and oftentimes, let's say, custodial leadership at Colt, Hall was determined to stay innovative, and was likely pleased to have received a letter from Matthew Browning describing a nearly impossible device. Without going into too much detail, a deal for the resulting patent would be signed in February of 1894. With years of work, it would develop into the Colt Model 1895 machine gun, jokingly known as the Potato Digger. While this never proved to be an especially strong financial success, it did put the Brownings down another lucrative path. John Moses Browning was an ideas man, so the contract on his machine gun was signed in February of 1894, and most of the fiddly work fell to the engineers at Colt, leaving his mind to wander to new topics. He became interested in automatic pistol design, which also suited the team at Colt, who were already working at the issue through their own man, Carl Ebbets. Formerly of Krupp in Germany, Ebbets immigrated to the US, working briefly for Pratt & Whitney and winding up at Colt, where he would serve as a mechanical engineer, eventually becoming the lead man on basically all new projects, and eventually took over the duties of being basically the patent attorney. Ebbets had filed for his own patent in October of 1894, covering a gas-powered auto-loading pistol. In February of 1896, he filed for another design, this time a blow-forward magazine-fed model. Both of these were purchased by Colt, and eventually saw some experimental development, though I'm unsure how far they progressed. Colt also licensed this early pistol patent from A.C. Wright, revealing that they were very much interested in keeping a hand in the auto-loading market. The first signs of Browning's interest in handguns appears in late 1894, with a prototype ready in early 1895. Based on his Potato Digger machine gun, this new pistol used an overhead lever blown up by excess gas and snapping down under spring pressure. This was likely deeply unsettling to the shooter, along with being very likely to disturb your aim, with both a flapping metal block and venting gas to deal with. I'm sure there was also a lot of perceived recoil with that much mass going off the center of the gun. However, the ball was now rolling for Browning's inventive mind. Once more, Colt would license the patent, although they never seemed to make use of it. Browning would keep at inventing, and instead of designing yet another automatic pistol, he cooked up 3. Unfortunately, I'm not able to pin down the order in which these guns were conceived or developed out in Ogden, Utah. However, he apparently brought all of them to Hartford, Connecticut, and his friends at Colt. From there, all 3 were filed for patents in October of 1896, likely after Colt's engineers had a tinker at them to expand them as much as possible. Each represented an entirely unique operating principle. In reverse patent order, we see a simple blowback pistol using a fixed barrel and small .32 caliber cartridge. Colt chose to license this design, but ultimately didn't use the patent as they wanted a more powerful locked breech design. Next up was a sleek-looking pistol with a short recoil lock centered on a rotating barrel. Capable of firing a .38 caliber cartridge, this could be martially viable. However, in the end, this concept wasn't developed further. Instead, they chose to focus on this, a short recoil locked breech pistol using a sort of dropping barrel lock, often compared to a parallel ruler. Twin links allowed the barrel to rise and fall, which sets lugs on its top into recesses in the oh boy. Today, any firearms fan understands what a pistol slide is, right? But at this point, this is a brand new concept. Browning's own invention, an extension off the front and sides of the breech block that encloses the action of the pistol and allows the user to manipulate the lock, all in one massive and for the time, very weirdly shaped piece. Even before these patents were filed, back in July of 1896, John and Matt Browning signed a royalty agreement with Colt's Patent Firearms for the exclusive right to make or have made and sales of automatic pistols covered by the Browning patents in the US and its territories. They also had sales rights to the British and Irish civilian markets, but Browning reserved the right to sell to the British government, although this too was later transferred to Colt, as we'll see. Colt also agreed to mark these pistols Browning patent, which became Browning's patent and was also required in all advertising of the handguns. Colt was responsible for policing those same patents in court and would owe the Brownings $1 in royalty for each pistol sold, not just for the life of the patent, but until his death. The Brownings would soon after sign a similar contract with Fabrique Nationale, who wanted the European market. So they and Colt would kind of actually have to go head to head in certain regions like South America. Unlike Colt, FN jumped on the little blowback concept and ultimately made huge profits with the eventual product, the FN 1900, which is a handy little pocket pistol we've already covered in some detail before. Colt kind of missed the bus on this one, but they were more military focused. They chose to work on the dropping barrel lock system. At first developing a top ejecting prototype, they soon moved to a side ejector and eventually incorporated a unique combination rear sight and safety feature, which we'll explore in a moment. This gun was paired with a 7-shot, single-stack detachable box magazine. However, this tripped over a patent by one Louis D. Dis. This was apparently held by Remington, and so Colt would have to pay a royalty on their magazines and mark them with the Dis patent until it finally expired. Colt stuck with the .38 caliber cartridge, which made perfect sense when you consider the US Army revolver of the time, which of course was the Colt New Army in various minor iterations. This double-action, swing-out cylinder loading, Colt-made revolver shot a fairly civilized .38 caliber cartridge. Smokeless powder repeating rifles had really driven home the concept of a small-bore, high-velocity cartridge, and like many European powers, the US had decided the benefits of a handier, faster-shooting revolver in .38 were better than a slow, heavy .45. For now. Don't get ahead of me, folks. Since small bore was okay, US Ordnance was also curious about the benefits of autoloaders and would experiment with them as early as 1894. The Navy had seen the bore chart very early, and the Army would test it further in 1896 and 1897. While it wasn't acceptable for service, it inspired further research. By early 1898, US Ordnance had laid hands on Bergmans, Mannlichers, and Mausers as well, but each had its own unique challenges to overcome before they could be ready for adoption. In October of 1898, Colt's Patent Firearms would send notice to Chief of Ordnance Daniel Webster Flagler that their own submission was finally ready, an automatic based on Browning's dropping barrel design. Flagler, in turn, was already organizing a new trials board, although it was currently focused on revolvers. Apparently, the US cavalry still had doubts about the .38 caliber cartridge and was favoring the old, slow, and heavy .45. They believed in that single-shot stopping power. This board may have also been formed because of the looming question of synchronizing the US Army, Navy, and Marines on a single shared cartridge for rifle, pistol, etc., making for much simpler logistics in wartime. Starting in November, the trials really focused on the questions of revolver caliber, single versus double action mechanisms, and some questions about swing-out cylinder loading. So the stars of the show were all wheel guns, and the end result was a win for the old new Army. Mostly because Colt promised to make some minor improvements and the .38 caliber cartridge was believed to be good enough for short-range work. Plus, they already had a lot of it lying around unshot, no need to waste taxpayer money. This was a different US Ordnance Department from today. Revolvers aside, this trials board also reviewed a handful of autoloaders. However, the question wasn't one of general issue, but whether or not automatic pistols could be used to displace having to carry both a revolver and a carbine on horseback. Could the cavalry get away with just an automatic carbine, the sort that might have a detachable shoulder stock? Borchardt, Mauser, Mannlicher, and Bergmann appeared once more, and this time Colt's prototype as well, although it did not have a stock. The ultimate result is that all failed. The board was of the opinion that automatic pistols had not yet reached a stage to justify their adoption in the place of, say, a revolver for service use. The small, low-powered pistol cartridges were also nowhere near enough to replace the service carbine. Ordnance would then spend the next year chasing Colt around about the changes to the new Army, and internally still debating the caliber question. The automatic pistol matter wasn't considered by Ordnance again until late 1899. Now under the auspices of Chief of Ordnance Brigadier General Adelbert Rinaldo Buffington, who ordered a board convened in November to consider the merits of 3 automatic pistols: the Mauser, the Mannlicher, and of course, the Colt automatic. Although those last 2 were unavailable at first. Colt felt their pistol needed some additional time and submitted it in January of 1900, with testing started in February. From the notes, we learn a few details. First, the pistol was listed as having 47 component parts, and it fired a unique .38 caliber rimless cartridge. This initial version used a jacketed .357 bullet, so 9mm. Weighing in at 105 grains and using 7.8 grains of smokeless powder, it produced 1,259 feet per second of velocity, measured at 53 feet, not necessarily the muzzle. The firearm took 5 minutes to disassemble and 12 minutes and 55 seconds to reassemble. I've been in that position before many a time. In test firing, roughly 760 rounds were discharged, with just a handful of failures, mostly attributed to poor fitting of the trigger and disconnect, which was mostly resolved by hand filing and refitting it on site. Fine sand had no effect on the action, however, a severe rust test revealed a minor issue. The slide was frozen to the frame, unable to be moved by hand, until someone wisely bashed it on a table, racked it a couple times, pushed it back into battery, and fired the first round. From there, it ran fine. From these tests alone, the firearm was already considered by many on the board to be suitable for service, but they decided to extend testing in order to determine what weaknesses may appear over continued firing, and to determine the potential lifespan of such a pistol. Over several months, 5,800 rounds would be fired from the test pistol, resulting in only a few minor stoppages, plus several majors. These were initial problems with the trigger group that were resolved with further hand fitting and a stiffer spring. 4 broken rear link pins, showing a need to reinforce that section of the action before adoption. 1 broken barrel, but that was due to a previously failed link pin, and 1 cracked slide, although this was blamed on a poorly fit replacement barrel for the broken barrel that was broken by the previously failed link pin. Short story, the Colt prototype was performing quite admirably, except for the link pin. Before the tests were even completed, John T. Thompson would write to the Chief of Ordnance, and included in his letter was the following quote: "The results of recent tests of Colt's automatic revolver at this armory have been so successful as to lead to the prediction that in a few years, all revolvers will be replaced by a suitable automatic pistol. A wise prediction from a future inventor." Actually, Thompson's advocacy would prove to be a great aid much further along in our story, so we will reintroduce him later in the series. While an overall success, the Colt was not perfect. Most notable were concerns about the lightweight bullet. Ordnance believed that particular projectile could be made heavier and slower, supposedly recommending a 130 grain bullet, which could be the origin of the standard .38 automatic Colt pistol cartridge loading that we see today. The result was the same jacketed .357 in case. However, it now moved at only 1,040 feet per second. Read that chart carefully, by the way, because this is not the much more common 380 ACP. This is the .38. From here, Colt's automatic was recommended for field trials. On May 10, 1900, U.S. Ordnance ordered 100 automatic pistols at a cost of $25 each, a hefty sum. 20,000 cartridges were purchased from the Union Metallic Cartridge Company at $18.53 per thousand. I would like that rate. 50 pistols shipped May 16th, then 25 more May 23rd, and the balance on June 1st. That's very fast. These pistols were marked US at the front of the trigger guard and were inspected by John T. Thompson, featuring his initials marked on the grip panel. For a modern viewer, this handgun is practically unremarkable except in the features that it lacks. However, please take note, this is now the first locked breech slide-operated handgun in military trials. Plus, it's using a detachable box magazine and firing a jacketed 9mm bullet. Sounds pretty advanced to me. On the orders of Chief of Ordnance Buffington, these pistols were to be distributed to commanding officers in several regions, very telling regions actually. Historical point, at the time Colt was developing this pistol, the US had entered and quite effectively won the Spanish-American War. Primarily a naval victory, the war still required quite a bit of direct small arms fire by infantry, cavalry, and the like. Despite a decisive win, the US Army learned some valuable lessons about its equipment. In the years following, we see a lot of decisions about unifying logistics, streamlining processes with the National Guard, and most notably for our show, a dissatisfaction with the standard infantry rifle. Ultimately, we see the then fairly new Krag-Jorgensen being outed in favor of what will become the Springfield 1903, although that quickly saw further revisions through 1906. The US also picked up a number of new territories bought off Spain as part of settling up the war. Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippine Islands came under US control, and Cuba was liberated into US occupation until 1902, and then again briefly in 1906. It should be no surprise that the 100 pistols would be issued abroad, 25 to Havana, 25 to San Juan, and 50 to Manila, which again is actually unsurprising. Most of the new territories had quickly and quietly fallen under US influence, but the Philippines were a strong exception. While US troops were initially welcomed, realization that they wouldn't be leaving anytime soon resulted in a continuation of the Philippines' War of Rebellion. And even that is a gross oversimplification, as there were far more myriad and diverse regional peoples in the Philippines, and the situation was a little splintered and complicated. Between 1899 and 1902, the US would average 40,000 troops in the region in an attempt to maintain control. This is where the Colt was most likely to get a real shakedown. Once received, the Colts were issued to officers of the infantry, cavalry, and artillery, and they were asked to assess the following points: the advantages or disadvantages of the automatic pistol compared to the revolver, the advantages or disadvantages of this particular pistol compared to the revolver, the advantages or disadvantages of this pistol compared to other automatics, the suitability of automatics for use by regular enlisted men, and if not suitable for the enlisted, was it advisable for pistols to be used by officers and NCOs? And the results? Well, most everyone said the automatic was more accurate shooting than the revolver. However, the gun was muzzle heavy and the grip was too short. There were requests for a lanyard ring, the disassembly was too difficult, the magazine release too small, and the magazine itself, being a separate but necessary part, upset several people. And apparently some experienced poor feeding of cartridges. Most were worried about using two hands to ready the pistol, as they favored carrying it chamber empty. And actually, this requires some explanation specific to the sight safety on this gun. So let's take a moment. Oh, that is awkward. Let's take a moment and get a closer look. Now, I'm not ready to show you the whole pistol just yet, but I do want to show you that sight safety so you understand what's going on. If I cock the hammer back, we'll see there's some texturing on the back of this rear sight, And if you're really observant, you'll notice that it has a hinge pin here, which means that it's able to move up and down. At the moment, it's in the down position, and here below it is the firing pin, which if I press on it, has just a little bit of flex, but then it stops because it's butting up against the rear sight / safety. If we flip it up, now it's brought up into a position where it's aligned with the front sight and zeroed for actual pistol shooting. And the firing pin is now free to be compressed further in, which means it can make contact with the actual primer at the other side of that breech block. This is a full-length firing pin. It's going the entire distance. Now, if we were to pull the trigger, we're going to drop that hammer onto the firing pin. The gun is going to discharge. Now, just to drive something home about the safety of this pistol, it uses a half-cock position, which means we cock the hammer back, pull the trigger, let it down past the first sear stop, and then we let it fall into the second sear stop where it cannot reach the firing pin and we cannot pull the trigger. That's a traditional half-cock safety. The problem with this is you get enough inertia like a dropped pistol and it can slip past it and then get through, or it can be hit hard enough to crack the tooth and go through. It's traditionally not been a favored safety going into the modern era, especially because it is all too common to have someone try to do this maneuver and then it's just a weird spring thing that slips and then it goes bang, right? And then when it goes bang, your finger and thumb are back here. Well, the way this sight safety is supposed to work is to prevent that exact problem. When it goes down, it blocks the firing pin, and therefore, if we pull this trigger, it's not able to strike the firing pin into the primer, and the gun is therefore safe. So it's just a matter of putting the sight down and then pulling the trigger. Boom. The problem with this setup is that, unfortunately, when you want to ready the gun, you ultimately have to recock the hammer and then flip up the sight. And even if you go around carrying it with the hammer back and the sight down, you still have to put the sight up. That seems like a very quick motion. You know, most manual safeties require just one click. But the problem is in the shape of this gun. Because if let me see if I can get the position on this. There we go, that's a bit better. Even with the hammer back, if I want to have a natural grip on the gun and bring my thumb up, it's hard to see, but I really do not have torque on this. It looks like my thumb can cover it easy on the inside of the hammer, but let me see if I can find a better angle. There we go. If I left hand this, I can show it to the camera, and honestly, we may have revealed that this is a little bit more ambidextrous than you might expect from an old gun. But it still is the same problem for a lefty or a righty, which is that if you look, this hammer is fighting my ability to rotate my thumb around enough to hit this safety. And sure, I got a big fat thumb and it looks like I got plenty of room, but when I try to actually push with it, it's hitting right in the dead zone of my thumb where I don't have the tip to work with, or really the heel. It's not quite, I can't get the heel over because of the knuckle. I could get the tip over, but it's so far down. Oh, okay, this is awful. Which means that I ultimately have to break my grip and come around to the outside of the gun. And when I come around to the outside of the gun, you can see I'm barely holding onto the gun in order to open up my meaty mitt enough to be able to work that sight safety, and I'm still having a hard time with it. So it's not a comfortable on-off button. Putting it much lower, as other guns have done, would have been a lot smarter. Now, you say, okay, well, there's all this. Why don't I just put that down, dry fire the gun, okay, and then go ahead and put it back up. So I reach in there and click it. Okay, that's good, except for the part that unless you actually end up in the half-cock position, if you accidentally end up in the all-the-way down position, like this, now you have a situation where if you're bouncing along, this thing is riding on the firing pin and it's full length, so it is on the primer, and any sort of sharp is going to set this gun off. It's a little bit of a sticky situation, and I'm sure unintended by the way it was designed. This mechanical situation created a desire in some for a rebounding hammer, and theoretically if that had been done, maybe a double action hammer so that it could be brought into action without having to manually cock it back. To be honest, these are fairly modern considerations already at play with a very early automatic. Now, along with the critiques came suggestions, and 2 points were repeated often by various officers. This copy of a drawing from Captain M.L. Buck sums it up nicely. They wanted a longer grip with room for another cartridge and felt that it was more natural to work the slide from the front. Moving the serrations up there would be an advantage. Buck also had a complaint about the cartridge feed angle, although that might have been his particular magazine. Now this may seem all doom and gloom for our pistol, but Lieutenant Lawson M. Fuller, Chief Ordnance Officer in the Philippines, accidentally sent along some praise in his otherwise critical report. A requisition has this day been made for 200 for sale to officers. The demand for any kind of automatic pistol can hardly be understood, and for this one in particular. It has become annoying. A great many orders have been received to be filled the moment any are received from the States for sale. So it seems that overall, the notion of an automatic pistol was gaining traction, although it was mostly from the bottom up. Well, that might work out well for Colt because they already had a commercial line spun up and ready. Remember, they had delivered 100 guns inside of a month. That's because they had already committed to serial manufacture of their new automatic. Clearly, to Colt, this was going to be a desirable gun of the future. The first commercial pistol was apparently sent in February of 1900 to Arthur Corbin Gould. Avid shooter, in 1900, Gould was editor of Shooting and Fishing, which would go on to become the American Rifleman. Colt also showed their new automatic at the March 1900 Sportsman's Show in New York City. However, it didn't seem to cause much sensation. Other autoloaders were already known, and their use for sporting purposes kind of a hot debate. The April 19th issue of Shooting and Fishing magazine featured a detailed illustrated article dedicated to Colt's new pistol, and I'm sorry to say that I couldn't find a copy for this episode. What you're seeing now is from the Iron Age a few months later, but it probably uses the same prints. These initial Colt automatics were identical to the US Army contract guns, they just weren't marked as such. Slide-operated, 7-shot magazines, rear serrations with a very tall external hammer and the sight safety. Now, obviously the commercial 1900 we have here today doesn't quite look like that, so let's keep digging for a little bit longer, which means returning to the world of military contracts, this time to the US Navy. In March of 1898, the Naval Inspector of Ordnance at Hartford wrote to Admiral Charles O'Neill, Chief of the Bureau of Ordnance, about the new Colt automatic pistol. While he described much of what we already know, he did make one comparison that I rather love. He compared the Browning barrel locking mechanism with its interrupted lugs to the Driggs-Schroeder locking mechanism, a contemporary artillery breech system. And to be honest, yeah, I can see it. In June of 1900, the Naval Proving Ground, Indian Head, Maryland, tested a single Colt automatic. This wasn't nearly as severe as Army trials, but they did do a pine board penetration test. 4.4 inches at 50 yards and 3.5 at 100 yards. That's not bad. In addition, accuracy was rated as good, though the balance was only fair, and recoil was considered somewhat heavy. Oh, okay. Curiously, they reported that the grip was slightly too large, and that the weapon was expected to be slower than the current revolver if shooting a large number of shots. I'm not even sure how they got that one, unless they were like loading rounds into the magazine and then loading magazine into the gun. That's all I can figure. Still, the Colt was worth considering further, and 250 would be ordered for trials in September of 1900. These were delivered October and November. Colt set aside a specific serial block this time, 1001 to 1250. Although the Navy also had them mark the pistols USN 1 to USN 250. In terms of construction, they were just like the Army trials pieces and the current commercial pattern. Although the serial number was moved to the right side of the frame, you should also find a trident or star marking on the trigger guard. The naval serial was stamped on the left, along with a B set in a triangle as an inspection mark. Unfortunately, I have no documentation on the wider naval trials. I just know that they did struggle to design a clamping method, which would allow them to hold the pistol perfectly still in order to test its potential precision at range. There were 2 pistols attempted to be used for this process. The first failed miserably. The second skated by the minimum requirements at 50 yards, but exceeded all expectations at 100. However, there were no further naval interests in the Colt automatic, which means our story must return back over to the Army. Working from the field reports, Colt attempted to integrate the requested improvements, so long as they didn't actually cost them any serious money. Okay, to be fair, once you have production underway, you're probably sitting on hundreds or thousands of expensive parts. So while this drawing seems fairly simple to us, that suggested grip extension is a major expense. If you're Colt, you're going to want to avoid integrating such a change if there's no guarantee it's necessary. Instead, Colt made what changes they could to the pistol without having to overhaul their castings or major jig work. So when the US Army came around for more pistols, likely driven by pressure from the officers in the Philippines, who greatly liked the idea of an automatic as we saw, Colt provided the following lightly modified design. The slide serrations were moved to the front, cut both longer and deeper, and somewhat crude checkering was added to the grips, which were also thickened up a bit. Ta-da! Totally fixed it, boys! In December of 1900, 200 pistols were ordered at $20 a piece, already a savings over last time, and now they received a spare magazine for each. 50,000 cartridges at a cost of $18.52 per 1,000 were purchased again from UMC. Colt jumped ahead to serial number 1501 and ran through 1,700 for this contract. Shipped in 4 lots of 50 pistols each, all were shipped by February of 1901. These were now inspected and marked by Ronaldo A. Carr, so you should have an RAC stamp on the right side trigger guard. I think. One source claims the second batch of 50 shipped and were not marked for unknown reasons. I have been unable to confirm this. The US stamping can still be found on the left side, and the standard serial was used. Apparently 3 pistols from this contract were taken for special use, and the remaining 197 were all shipped to Manila, further evidence that the Philippine fighting was driving the interest in fast and powerful automatic pistols. Alright, while my example here is not from the Army contract, it is in the same general configuration. So let's get a closer look. Alright, we have a fairly long, but otherwise very familiar looking handgun to the modern viewer, right? We know that this is our slide, we know this is our hammer, our trigger and trigger guard, we know where our grip panels are, and we understand, most likely if you've seen any sort of modern handgun, that we have a magazine in here. Single stack in this case, not like our normal double stacks these days, but otherwise, okay, it's a handgun. And don't forget, it's the first handgun to look like this. Yes, some of these features appeared before this, but not like this. This is revolutionary. So let's talk about what we got. Number one, if these seem a bit shiny and new, that's because they are. These are reproduction, and I put them on there in order to avoid confusion with a point that we'll meet later on in the episode. All right, number two, let's check out the slide, because that's sort of the heart of what makes this gun different. If I take this guy over here, we can better see our long but rather shallow and fairly soft feeling serrations. There's a little, yeah, even my fingernail's not really catching, right? So these are good, but they're not what we'd understand as modern. And again, we'll see some changes later on in the lifespan of this pistol. But for now, they're located at the front. They had been at the rear. Nothing there now because, of course, you can't put them on both. That would be silly and confusing. And if we just give them a pinch and pull, we can work that slide. Now, you may notice that slide does not lock open, and the magazine is still in the gun. So whenever you run out of your 7 rounds, the gun looks like this, and you're just going to probably, if you're not counting, go ahead and fire on an empty. And then you'll notice. So that's another issue that will be addressed in the future. Turning to the magazine, it's a push forward release with a toe on the magazine to help you pull out as they come free. This is the original nickeled magazine with the DIS patent marking. So this is not a Browning patent. This is that patent from DISS, as controlled by Remington at the time. Again, we already saw this earlier, but there is our sight safety. With the hammer back, we put it down to lock the firing pin. If we pull the trigger, the hammer comes forward and will not be able to push the firing pin into the primer. If we have this popped up, then it can, although again, we're in the half cock at the moment. While we're back here, I'd like you guys to pay attention to just how big that hammer is. Real high, really awkward to use one-handed. Now let's talk disassembly. I'm unsure if there was an original tool included with these for the process, but ultimately all you need is either a bit of wire, or in this case, I've stolen an Allen key of appropriate thickness. Now if you go too thin on this, it won't quite work because it doesn't have the diameter necessary to keep it from over tipping. I'll show you why in a second. But as long as you have a little piece of wire that you guys can probably barely see, you can go ahead and begin the process, which first starts with getting that slide slightly to the rear. You want to get this block back past a little hole that's under here that I'll show you in a minute. So I'll just pull that back, and there's no lock open, so I have to hold it really awkwardly, and there's no grasping grooves at the rear now, so I have to hold it really awkwardly. Now, as I squeeze this to death to hold the slide to the rear, we can put our pin in here, and then, as we let the slide forward, I'm gonna feel some tension. See how it wants to tip? That's because there's an internal plunger pushing on this guy now. And if we let her forward past that point, and it takes a little wanting to do it and having the pin in at just the right depth. Give me 1 second there. There we go. Aha! I have now stopped the plunger, and we can start pushing out this block. Now, my middle finger is on the other side of the gun and can raise it quite easily now that there's no tension, and I can just pluck it from the action. Pay attention to the orientation of the block. See that half circle cut in it to match the plunger that's inside? You're gonna wanna assemble this the right way. There's also, it might be hard to make out, a little pin on there that lets you know that it needs to insert on this little dimple here. It goes in exactly one way. So right that way for assembly, and then pulling it on out for disassembly. Do not lose this. It is critical to the function of the handgun. All right. With the cross block out, we can then retract the slide, which will now come all the way off the rear of the pistol. You do not want to fire the Colt 1900 without the cross block in place, or you will get a nasty surprise. This to me is not ideal, but it'll stick around for quite a while. Once we're inside, we'll see a couple of unique features. Number one, a slide. It doesn't seem like much now. As a matter of fact, this one's pretty dang simple. If we look at the front, we can see there's really nothing to it. I mean, it's just wide open, milled from front to rear. Now, the rear does have the breech block, so it's at least somewhat solid. Although that's the part that comes back at your face, so maybe not ideal. Inside of here is our full-length firing pin. So if I release the safety, we should be able to poke this at the rear and have it project from the front. I don't know. Let's see if you guys can, ooh, this is hard to do upside down. Yeah, you can just barely see it there poking out. So full-length firing pin inside of a breech block with all this extra stuff attached to it. Seems normal enough to us, but at the time, this is really inventive, this idea of having an encapsulated breech block with all this extra metal to the front. While we're here, you may notice there's a couple of lugs set inside of the top of the slide. These are for locking the slide to the barrel for a short distance for a short recoil operation. We'll see it better in the animation, but let me go ahead and show you that barrel. There we go. In this position, let me get her down, we can see a little bit more what's happening. With the barrel forward, it would be engaged into the recesses in the slide with these lugs here, locked together. As they both travel rearward, look at that, our barrel's lowering. Once it gets low enough, it's no longer locked to the slide goes back on its own. Gonna be easier to see in our animation, but you get the idea. That lowering as it goes backwards, that swing is caused by two links. One link here, both in a figure 8 configuration that we can't really show easily without taking the gun further apart. But check it out, there's that parallel ruler. And some of you are used to the 1911 in which the back goes down and then the front goes up, but no, these guys are staying right aligned with each other all the way back. This is the first of the swinging link systems. Well, I think we've seen as far as we can without X-ray vision, so let's get this over for an animation.
First, we'll load up our single stack box magazine. Like so many other automatics, we'll be readying the pistol by manually retracting this sliding breech block. However, because this is the 1900, this is the first time in history that what we know of as the modern slide has been introduced on a pistol. So let's appreciate that while we draw it back and release. Now the slide isn't just for readying the gun or keeping the components protected. It also locks the breech to the barrel. A set of recesses in the top of the slide match up with lugs on the top of the barrel when it is in the upright and forward position. Firing the pistol causes the barrel and slide to recoil rearward, and for a short while they are locked together until the barrel is swung downwards by a set of two links, one at the front and one at the rear. Let's see that again, and pay attention to those swinging links. Up and forward is locked. down and rearward unlocked, which allows the breech block to carry on by itself, extracting, ejecting, and feeding the next round. The slide is held to the frame by this cross block, and the block rides in a channel, which also contains two important springs. This is the recoil spring, responsible for returning the slide forward, and behind it is a buffer spring. This is meant to cushion the impact of the slide as it is halted in its rearward travel by the fully compressed springs. The trigger uses a unique wraparound transfer bar configuration, which encircles the magazine and provides for a very even linear pull. Pulling the trigger, of course, tips this sear, which in turn releases the hammer. Unless, of course, we manually place the hammer in the half-cocked position, which has a slight overhand to prevent the sear from moving, and therefore locks up the trigger. This is the disconnector. While it seems simple at first, it has a somewhat complicated interaction with the trigger and sear. It's powered by one of several tines off a combination mainspring. This complicated piece saved on having to make and mount several flat springs. The outer tines simply push on the sear, keeping it tight against the hammer when possible. The inner tine pushes the trigger forward and the disconnector upwards. Let's get a better view. With the disconnector highlighted, watch how it interacts with the center spring tine. We pull the trigger, which tips the sear, the gun discharges, and the slide pushes downwards on the disconnector. This flexes the center tine downwards as well, under the sear. Once the slide returns, the tine is still stuck under the sear, until we release the trigger. This is how fully automatic fire is prevented. Finally, here is our firing pin, which on its own is very straightforward. A full-length firing pin that is pressed on by the hammer in order to strike the cartridge's primer, along with a coil spring to make sure it returns rearward. However, the firing pin has a specific shape so that it can interact with the combination rear sight and safety lever. This is a two-position switch. When lowered, a tab turns into the notch at the top of the firing pin, preventing it from being driven forward when the hammer drops. The user is further warned the gun is unsafe by the fact that the rear sight has effectively disappeared. Flipping it up releases the firing pin and allows us to discharge the pistol. Alright, that's about it. A system both simple and complicated and destined to be incredibly influential. Let's go shoot it.
Honestly, this has got to be one of the coolest episodes we've done to date. Thanks again, Sven, for making a multi-year dream come true. Alright, so this pistol was in trials in the Philippines for a second time. How did it do now? Well, on the pro side, it was easier to operate and believed to have better endurance than the Revolver. It was also less likely to get out of order. Just a reminder, by the way, at this point the two most likely comparable handguns in the Philippines would be the Colt New Army 38 caliber double action and the Colt Single Action Army 45 caliber single action. I know I'm kicking an ant's nest by saying this, but both of these revolvers required a fair bit more field armor support than you would really think today. Returning to the automatic, it was very fast firing, could be loaded with either hand, and had a faster, flatter shooting cartridge, which gave better accuracy. Alright, this is going better than last time so far, but what about the negatives? Well, the ejection port was too small, several officers experienced poor feeding again, firing pins broke, And this kind of starts up the same problems that we saw last time, that the firing pin was too long, the sight safety annoying. Without improving those 2 points, the gun therefore requires 2 hands to ready because you're carrying it chamber empty. The length of the grip should be longer, and adding 1 more round of capacity wouldn't go over too poorly either while you're at it. The front serrations were still not quite right. Where's the lanyard ring? And perhaps more so than before, there was a distrust for the .38 caliber cartridge in terms of overall power. They wanted something bigger. Overall, only 29% of the officers were in favor of the pistol as was, with 51% against. The remainder didn't specify clearly, it seems. Now, curiously, even as the Second Army contract was being fulfilled, Colt was working on the more severe changes. Apparently, their stall didn't even hold out long enough to await the results of the second trials piece, which is just as well because, as we just saw, those issues just kept coming back up anyway. Ultimately, these would be resolved in a complete model change. However, that gun isn't going to be in this episode. Instead, we need to talk about the further development of the commercial pistol, the first Colt automatic pistol. Here's the deal. Colt might have bitten off a bit too much setting up full manufacture of this handgun. They expected to make the same gun for both military and civilian contracts, and were hoping for an adoption without major modification. When that plan failed, they already had a lot of forgings and other parts made for this guy right here in big batches. So just because the Army was going to go in a new direction, they couldn't just throw out a bunch of valuable material. Instead, they sought to keep marketing and selling this guy into the civilian realm. Now I need to clear something up before we proceed. The pistol I have today had, up until this point, only been known as the automatic Colt pistol, or as it was often called, Colt's automatic pistol. It didn't have a model name or date because it was the only Colt semi-automatic handgun. With the introduction of that military model of 1902, that we will cover next time by the way, our gun today would retroactively be considered the model of 1900, although I don't believe Colt ever referred to it as such. Despite being abandoned by the military, this model 1900 still saw a little bit more development. And the first and most obvious change would be the deletion of the rear sight safety. No one liked that thing. The decision to remove it from production was apparently made in April of 1901, and this kind of coincides with the development of the model 1902. However, Colt couldn't just take a bunch of already produced slides and toss them into the garbage. That would be a huge financial loss, so they would need to recycle what they had before making a dedicated new slide for their commercial sales. The solution was simple-ish. Remove the rear sight, remove the old firing pin, dovetail cut the slide for a new rear sight, and then fill in the gap where the safety was with a properly shaped plug. Use the old sight pivot pin in order to lock in that plug. This arrangement allowed for the new and better firing pin to be inserted into the gun, but did necessitate drilling for and fitting another cross pin through the slide in order to now retain that firing pin. And this is where trying to split this story between models gets a little bit weird, because the whole point of the new rear sight and firing pin was to standardize this model 1900 with the new features of the 1902 so that they could share parts. And I want to explore that in detail, but I'm going to do that next time. For the moment, let's just say that the new firing pin is better, and I'll tell you why on our next episode. The result of all this was an updated model 1900 with a traditional rear sight and an extra pin and plug. These converted 1900s were also fitted with a new lower profile rounded hammer known as the stub hammer at Colt. You might also notice the molded hard rubber grips. These two were added to production in April of 1901. Heck, my repros weren't even here when we filmed the firing sequence, so Mae got to shoot it with its factory hard rubber grips. Now, for a few months, if you ordered a Colt automatic, you had about a 50-50 chance of getting a sight safety or the modified pistols, until December of 1901, which is when production was halted for several days in order to take the time to modify every existing slide on hand. However, Colt still had a lot of high spur hammers, so even the modified guns would carry either a stub or high hammer for quite a while. Supposedly, they were fitted on alternating serial number guns. Slowly, the old slides would be used up, apparently around, let's say, serial 3500. This is 3400-ish. And Colt would have to produce dedicated new slides without giving too much away. This was simple because it was the exact same slide as the new military model that we're discussing next time. almost. The military model slide had one additional little cut out of it, so no big deal, and they could use the same forgings and the same milling and cutting, minus one little process. The result would be this, same as the last pistol, but without the filler block and extra cross pin. At heart, a model 1900, but collectors have long begged to differ. For Colt's part, they started advertising their military model and needed to distinguish the old model in some clear manner, so it was billed as the sporting model. Since the military model was the model of 1902, the fair assumption was that the other modified pistol was the sporting model of 1902. Colt did not consider it as such, but that's the name that sticks to this day. I actually have mixed feelings about what to call a, let's say, sporting model compared to the original sight safety that we have here today. The hammer, safety, and firing pin were all really changed, so that's worthy of a new model designation. However, within the sporting model, more changes would follow as Colt rolled in parts and processes from their advancing military designs. This very late production sporting model has two further modifications. It uses the Colt military model of 1902 takedown system, which we'll again show you in the next episode, and it also features triangularly cut rearward slide serrations taken from yet another change in the military trials. Now these two changes occurred around serial number 4700, and then later the second one around serial number 8000. So even the sporting model had some further evolution in large block segments. The original sight safeties and the later sporting models were considered one continuous gun by Colt, serial numbered from 1 to 10,999. Colt had reserved the 11,000 block and beyond for their military model, and some other guns that we'll mention later. Right at the end of production, the sporting models jumped to the 30,000 serial number range, only reaching 30,190. Now adding this together, we would assume 11,191 pistols, but it's more likely that they fell a little short of that count thanks to factory discards, special test guns, etc. It's estimated around 3,000 were sight safeties. Ledgers say 1,274 were actually made with the modified fixed sights, making them rare. However, an unknown number were factory converted from the first to the second pattern whenever they were sent in for repair. From there, we know that the sporting model proper is the most numerous to be encountered. Manufacture was halted around July of 1907, although I'm unsure if that was raw production or included assembly. In August of that same year, they would send a letter to the various advertisers that the model was being dropped from the catalog. Apparently the remaining inventory was out of the factory by the end of the year. Now, by this time, Colt had introduced a fairly wide variety of automatics. The 1902 military, the 1903 pocket hammer, the blowback 32 ACP pocket hammerless, the 1905 45 caliber military model, and they were in the process of releasing their version of Browning's 25 ACP vest pocket model. So yeah, it's a pretty crowded market even from its own company. Still, quite the legacy sprouting from the somewhat unloved original automatic Colt. Alright, I have way more to cover on this family of handguns, but it's going to have to wait until next time. I'm sorry folks, this is a very long and winding story, but before you go, why not stick around and hear Mae's opinion on what it's like to shoot the original Colt automatic, the Model 1900. Alright, once more we've made room for Mae.
Hello!
And we still have this Colt 1900 pistol. Let me hand that over to you.
Thank you.
Now, this is a difficult one. Because if I hand you that gun as a modern shooter,
Okay.
the first things you're noticing are what's not on the gun, I assume.
Well, what do you mean?
Like no manual safety, no slide release, none of the stuff that we expect on a modern slide operated
No,
pistol.
I expect it to all be right here on the left-hand side with my thumb, too.
Yeah, you're expecting a whole bunch, like mag release. Nothing's there.
Right.
So this gun looks naked from the modern perspective. But
Very naked.
let's rewind our minds for a second. It's 1900.
Okay.
You have seen the C96.
Yep.
You have seen the Luger 1900.
The Swiss one, yes.
The brand new one. You may have seen some Bergmans or the Borchardt, but let's put those aside because those didn't go anywhere in terms of adoption.
Maybe the FN 1900?
The FN 1900, which is actually the little brother to this guy.
Right.
The FN 1900 technically being, well, the FN 1899, which is the precursor to being the first slide-operated handgun to be released in the market at all, but it was blowback. And even though it was slide-operated, the slide was kind of tucked in, and it was really weird, and you grabbed it from the rear. It wasn't what we think of as a slide. This is the first pistol to have a modern slide. So, with your 1900 eyes, what's it like when you see this thing for the first time?
Well, I'd probably want some assistance in operation with this guy because it's a little bit confusing where it's just like, where, like you said, where is everything? It's so naked. How am I supposed to do it? The serrations luckily give you a clue.
Yeah,
where it's like...
We've almost hit the horseshoe theory of handgun development, right?
Right.
It's gone... You, as the person in 1900, expect a bunch of external crap on it.
I'm expecting like external, like a barrel to be visible. Where's the barrel?
Right.
I mean, I can see a little tip right here, but obviously, like we're going from like the Luger and the C96.
Everything's mounted.
Gone.
Everything starts as like a barrel and a clockwork system, and then they build everything outside of it, right?
Right.
And so you end up with all this stuff hanging off the gun.
Uh-huh.
Now the gun is naked. And nowadays it's the same thing where we expect there to be controls of some sort on the left side. They're not even in this gun. So to us it looks naked. Everybody thinks the gun looks naked.
It's very sleek looking. I mean, it's not what I'm expecting at all. But it kind of makes me nervous how plain it looks. Because I'm just like, is this going to go? Like if I've got that mentality of 1900, I'm like, how is this thing going to shoot?
It looks like a prototype, doesn't it?
Basically, yeah, that's what I'm thinking of. Like if it's even now I'm like 3D printed, it's like, oh, this is obviously a blank. Right. You know, it's not real. It's blank.
Oh man, yeah, it really looks like retrofuturism to me. Like it looks like a spaceship from the 1950s, but obviously it's from 1900.
Right.
So once you're shown how to use it, what do we start thinking about this thing?
Well, we start thinking about actually handling it. So first things first, I've been given it, right? So I've got it in my hand. The first feel I've got with this gun is the grip, essentially. There's a nice beaver tail back here for the top webbing of my hand. And then there's a little bit of contouring going back here down at the base.
It's not straight up and down.
No. It's not straight up and down. It's got a little angle to it, but it's not a great angle. It's not Luger-like. Definitely not that. And it's definitely not C96-esque. But it does not feel amazing. It's just okay because it doesn't feel like it's very polished. Like the edges are still kind of not curved. And then it feels very narrow, but it almost feels like there's like a double hump going on here. From the metal to the wood, I'm like, hump. There's no like gradually getting to there.
For me, I felt like I had a fairly sharp thing in my webbing.
Yeah.
And then it widened up. And it was a very weird feeling.
Yeah, it's not amazing. It's okay. Like I say what they were going for with it, and there's potential here, but it definitely gets to be better. And then the base of the magazine down here, it feels like I want it to be a little longer almost.
It curves away all of a sudden.
Yeah, it's like it's just suddenly gone.
I don't know.
I'm left with a little bit extra down here. I mean, it doesn't look it, but it kind of feels it. I don't know how to explain that.
I don't know if it's too short or if it just has the...
Because I've got a full finger grip. It shouldn't feel like it's almost short, but it kind of almost feels like it does.
Your hand, you mostly fit on that thing.
Yeah.
My hand, I come off the end of it. So with my bigger hands... So here's the problem. The bottom of the gun is coming down past the meatiest part of my hand. Shouldn't be a problem.
Right.
But they've gone ahead and milled it to be a curve. And so that curve is hitting right where I normally can balance a revolver thanks to the bell grips.
Do you feel like you could kind of just do this in your hand with your fingers and it would just rock back and forth easily?
Yeah, so the lower vertice of this thing is hitting right in the middle of my hand, which means when I flex my hand and everything, I get an unusual amount of movement in the gun.
Meanwhile, if you do that with a Luger, it's just stable. It's just
the Luger doesn't stop at that point.
Hand. No.
No, it goes beyond it. And
which is great.
I agree with Ordnance that it was too short.
Oh, yeah, they did talk about that.
And even if it wasn't too short, they should have straightened it up. I think if they had made it straight, they'd have never gotten the complaint about it being too short.
Probably not.
Anyway, so that's the grip.
And then so I've gripped it and I'm probably going to point it. Oh, man. It is definitely muzzle heavy, but I don't know how to explain it. The gun, for the size that it is, I'm expecting more weight to it. I know this is just over 2 pounds, but it kind of doesn't feel... Like, again, it's got that blank mentality sensation to it where I'm like, is this a real gun? It feels lighter than what it should be.
Well, if you have the period mindset, you're handed a gun like that looks like a big chunk of metal. So you expect a lot of weight at the front.
Right.
And don't get me wrong, the front's heavy.
But it's not as heavy as I think it should be.
Right. Okay.
That's weird.
So how does it point? Don't even worry about the sights. Don't worry about the sights yet. Just pointing.
Okay, just pointing.
Is it a natural pointer or does it feel a little weird?
No, it is kind of... There's a naturalness to it, I want to say. Like, I think it's just because, like, it's just so... flat?
Yeah.
It just kind of feels like it's just laying flat in my hand. It's like if I just had, like, if I took a thick piece of cardboard and cut it out, it feels like if I took that and just went, I'd be like, yeah, of course it's right where I pointed the cardboard flat edges.
I find that when I go to point this thing, I end up just a little bit low, just a little bit.
Do you?
And again, it's because of that rounding and my hand being larger than yours. It wants to roll over.
So yeah, you would dip a little bit
So muzzle
more.
heavy, round at the heel, I end up a little bit low, and I have to consciously torque it back up. But that's me.
Yeah, that's
Now,
fair.
using your sights, what have we got going on?
Well, I was going to get that in a second. I did want to make sure I mentioned the magazine release on this guy before we got, because I figured we might end up talking about this sight hammer bit.
You're right. That gets deep.
So I've never really been a fan of heel releases, but this one's actually not too bad because it's not like I'm having to do two opposite motions or I'm having to do some weird fiddly bits. I'm not having to push anything out of my way. I just do a pinch. So you just pinch it and grip, and then you can go. It's pretty simple, and the release is actually sticking out pretty deep down here. This tongue and the tongue sticking out the front of the mag is pretty great. Easy motion, nice and simple.
I wouldn't call it the most positive thing in the world, though.
No,
like,
it doesn't. It doesn't stick it out. Like it doesn't pop it out. Like if I depress this, it doesn't do anything.
I still feel like I'd prefer to have a fingernail while doing that.
Oh yeah.
If you can't do it without fingernails, it's probably getting to be a little too finely dexterous. You know what I mean?
I will say, if I'm going from the Luger to this, if I'm looking at the Luger, I'm like, oh my God, they have a button right there. There's room. They could have done it on this one. Why not?
Okay. So now I think we should talk about that rear sight.
Yeah. So.
Rear sight first.
Well, I have to get it ready.
Okay, I'm just telling you. Let's talk about the sight first because there's a lot here.
Okay, so my rear sight. All right, so it's it's surprisingly tall, but the U-notch in there is a bit soft. I think it could stand to be a little bit deeper, but I don't know if that would, because I don't know. I know what this part is supposed to be, but I don't know if taking out more metal would have weakened it too much, and that's why it's as deep as it is.
A very fine, shallow U-notch sight. Which
yes.
I think it reads a little soft. I agree with you.
I agree. Yeah. But it is raised up tall, so there's no mistaking what the heck I'm looking down. But I also know this is the safety as well. So...
let's talk about how that works.
Okay.
You have readied the gun. So you racked your slide, right?
I'm ready to go. Yeah.
Speaking of which, how's that? We haven't even talked about that.
Oh, shit. We didn't talk about it. Okay, real quick. So you expect the slide to actually be...
hammer down.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, fine. Hammer down.
You gotta do it in its worst condition.
Its worst condition.
Okay,
this
with
is
the hammer
worst
pressure and everything.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, how's the slide?
Really light. Is that spring supposed to be that light, actually?
It's a locked breech pistol, ran fine. Well, ran fine enough with the spring in mind. We have other issues. But no, that seems to be correct.
Although, so I know this is supposed to be the safety and everything.
Yeah.
It would have been really neat.
Oh, no, don't talk about how it works first, because I know where you're going.
You know exactly what I think. Okay,
yeah, okay.
I have an idea with
instead
this.
Of safety. So slide's fine. We got there.
All right, so I've
Get your
recocked
safety
it.
up.
Safety's up.
When you put the safety...
So it's off.
Yeah,
it's off in the up position.
The rear sight is the safety. I've already shown it to you. When you put it down, it blocks the firing pin.
Yep. So down, safety's on.
Oh, no, don't do anything else yet. This is where it gets complicated. You may now holster your pistol this way.
Okay.
And it's safe.
Sure.
Okay, but then that hammer's sticking way out.
And this hammer, unfortunately, is...
Yeah,
it's not... It's just weird. It sticks out at a bizarre angle that looks like it's going to catch on stuff.
Would you be inclined to carry it with that hammer back like that?
Probably not, because it wouldn't have been... I would have had less of a concern about... I think back then, less of a concern about it being ready, more of a concern about snagging on things.
And snapping off and blah, blah, blah.
Right.
Now, there is such a thing as cocked and locked later on. Those hammers aren't nearly as aggressive as this one. Now, you could also choose to let the hammer down.
Yep, okay.
And you have two positions to choose from.
So this is the first one, where it's all the way forward.
No, there might be a half cock in there. There should be.
I don't think I was there yet. Or maybe I was.
Oh, you are in the half cock.
Okay, I am in the half cock.
So you can go down to the half cock, and you're half cocked, and you've got the hammer block, so if it slips past the half cock, it hits it. Or you can, you'd have to cock it back, I guess, and then really let it all the way down, or just dry fire it.
Because this is just going to be hitting the safety. It's not going to be...
Yeah, it's hammer blocked.
Okay.
So you can carry it all the way down. Yep. By the way, kind of terrifying too. Right.
And there's no... I don't want to take the safety off in this position. I'd want to make sure I pull the hammer back, because otherwise if I take the safety off and there's the round in the chamber, then that's just the hammer resting on the firing pin.
So... yeah. So worst case, you have hammer down, safety on. And it goes in your holster.
Right. This is the worst case in that you're the least ready in this position.
Right. So there's an emergency.
Okay.
You draw your pistol.
Yeah. Okay.
And then you ready your hammer.
Wah!
Already not
No,
great.
not
that
great.
was really
That was
weirdly
terrible.
two-handed.
Yeah, I know.
Can you even do it one-handed?
Hold on. Well, I mean, to be fair, yes, but it's really awkward, and I have to
Wow, that
reach
is a
up,
grip.
and I have to grab like right up here with the ejection port. You try to do this
Yes,
quickly.
clearly being female has ruined this for her.
Oh my God.
Now I will use my large manly hand to show her exactly how to do this. No, I still had to hook it with my pinky. Even with my sort of better mitt for this, I can... Muscularly, I don't think I can get the hammer back unless I wrap a pinky. This goes back to the old Walker issue.
And look, you're going up to the ejection port. I just saw you sneaking up there.
And I'm balancing further down the gun.
Yep.
Now, in their day, they probably would have just gone ahead and written... Safety first, mind you. But 100 years ago, not really. It was third.
No.
Because they would have just left their finger in here and then done this. And they'd have had the torque inside the trigger guard that I'm using. I'm using the trigger guard.
I mean, sure, that sounds nice in terms of just the extra...
But it's still,
position.
Why am I having to do all this? This is a really awful hammer position.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, truly awful, folks.
It's just because of how high up that angle is. If the angle had even been adjusted 15 degrees lower, I think it still would have been way better.
All right, so we get the hammer back.
Yep, and then you got to flip safety up.
Well, hold on. That's in worst case scenario, you had it down.
Mm-hmm.
Or best case scenario, you had it, let's say, cocked and locked, although that's not really what it is.
Right.
So you didn't have to mess with the hammer at all.
Okay.
All right, so now... Even in the best scenario in which you just had the manual safety down and the hammer back, let's get that safety in a hurry.
So I can't... So I cannot... You might be able to with your hand. I can't... Okay, I barely just could still keep my thumb on this side. I found it easier last time to come around and get it, but now I'm struggling. I don't know how I did it on range, but somehow on range that day, it was easier to bring my thumb around to grab it than it was to reach on the rough side.
You look like an animal that doesn't have thumbs trying to use a game controller.
I just don't have the spread on my hand.
Yeah, automatically I'm going to reach around the hammer and hit it, but boy, look how loose my grip is on this gun.
Right, now it's loose and it's,
If I reach the inside of the hammer, I can't really heel it with my thumb. I can't really...
And you can do that at least, but I can't...
It's awful, though.
I can't get up there high enough.
I am grinding my thumb against the hammer to protect
I'm
it.
hoping the hammer's going to help give me some, leverage.
Abysmal.
It's not easy to do quickly one-handed. But on two hands, even if I was using two hands, still.
All right, so we've managed to get the gun ready to shoot.
Hooray.
What's it like actually shooting it?
Okay, we already talked about the sights. We already talked about the weight balance. Loading her up was pretty simple. Racking slide. Pretty much it's just trigger and recoil from that. So the trigger on this one is creaky at first, and it doesn't have a lot of travel until you reach a sudden cliff, and it's like maybe the weight increases by half a pound.
Right.
And then you think, oh boy, here it comes.
Right.
And then you're just like, click. And I'm like, wait, that already happened? It's already done?
It is extremely nice trigger.
Oh, yeah. The creaky part at the very front end is, the first part is kind of weird, and it feels bizarre that it's creaking. But...
It definitely makes me think I'm about to have a very bad trigger experience.
Right, yeah. But then that second part is beautifully crisp.
Yes.
It's very nice. So it's like, I don't know how to feel about this. I guess middle of the road.
A lovely trigger. I would... Hands down, one of the best triggers so far.
It does feel really good.
Okay. And then, once it goes bang.
Yeah, so there is actually a fair bit of recoil with this one.
Well, we're using the 38 ACP cartridge, not to be confused with 380.
Right, that was made with this one.
Vaguely, this is like a 9mm in the ballpark. It's actually fairly in the ballpark of 9mm parabellum.
Yeah, I guess it didn't feel like it was snapping that bad because the weight up at the front was probably helping to bring it down, but there still was a fair bit of power behind it. It definitely felt like a powerful cartridge.
It felt authoritative.
Yeah.
But not abusive.
No, it definitely didn't feel extreme, which I guess it felt like it could have been more extreme coming out of this guy.
So if we talk about this versus the Colt New Army 38 double action revolver, you've shot that.
Yeah.
Would you say that you feel faster on target between that or this?
This.
And you get an extra round.
Right.
And the cartridge is a little more authoritative.
Slightly, yes.
So between the two, if you're ordnance?
Yeah, no, this hands down would have to win between the two. Plus it's semi-automatic, mag concealed. That's pretty good. Everything, and this in terms of just protection against mud and muck compared to a revolver, Hands down, got to win there.
Well, revolvers are usually pretty good about dealing with that thing, but this is a very reliable structure. Compared to especially the new Army.
It feels very solid, too.
The new Army was a very fiddly system. As a matter of fact, ever since I did that episode, I might have to revisit it. The new Army was more fiddly than we think, and I'm about to say why soon. But this gun is more robust than that particular revolver.
Yeah, definitely. This gives me more confidence. Now, I did not shoot with these grips, though. I will say that.
No, you had the original hard rubbers that were with it, and when we say hard rubber, it's plastic.
Right. There was a little more traction with those, I'd say, and they didn't stick out quite as far as these wood ones did. So it was a little tighter grip.
Nice. Okay, so overall, would you rate it a good experience, bad experience, exciting?
I actually would rate it as a pretty exciting experience, just because I've been looking forward to this road to the 1911 that we planned on starting, that we've been talking about for 4 years now?
Yes, this is
This has been a 4-year plan, 5-year plan?
When you're C&Rsenal and everybody wants you to do the 1911, you can't just go do a regular episode. No. You got to make a statement.
And this was our original plan, which was to try to work our way up to the 1911.
Yes. The most recent world phenomena has kept us from that for quite a while. But again, thank you, Sven.
Yes. So, thank you, Manticore Arms.
We don't really have a war for this. This is a prototype pistol that saw commercial sales but never was adopted.
So all we really have for comparison for other semi-automatic pistols at the time, like you said, are the Luger, the C&N96, and maybe the FN 1899.
Yeah, FN 1900.
So I said maybe.
Yeah, but the FN 1900 is unfair. It's a little 32 blowback.
Right.
But in terms of lock breech, full power pistol cartridges, you're right.
The two big boys.
C96 and Swiss Luger are the most comparable.
Right.
If we let the Luger go ahead and advance to the German, let's say, naval P04 or Army P08, and we just get the better version of the Luger, because they're so close, let's let them have it, right? Where does this gun sort of stack with them? In the only comparable conflict that we have, which is so much later, it's World War I. It's the way we usually talk about these things. If you go into something like World War I with this very early automatic, do you feel that you're in a significant disadvantage?
All right, let's start with actually some positive things on this one.
Okay.
Slight operation of this guy to ready this gun. Everything is all right here. That's pretty good. That's pretty positive.
Nice and modern.
The trigger feels pretty great. The weight balance is not terrible for me. It's got a nice heel release by comparison to
other heel releases.
I guess there aren't any for comparing the two, but it's not as good as the Luger's release, which is the button.
Okay, so the Luger has a better magazine release.
Right.
But the C96 is stripper clip fed.
Right. Of course, I'm going to pick this over C96 all day long just for that.
Okay.
But then the safety hammer combo on this guy, god awful. Like the Luger has it beat hands down in that area.
We're kind of getting into that same territory as the C96, where it's like, how the heck do we carry this thing? Because if we want to carry it ready on the C96, you had to let that hammer down, which is scary.
Oh wait, are we forgetting like the Mannlicher 1900?
Like the 1905 was around. I mean, the 1901 was right there, but we never really. That's getting into a whole other territory. So I think we're better. And also, it's still technically a blowback by the time it's adopted.
Yeah.
So let's just talk about.
And that's still stripper clip.
Yeah. So let's stay on focus for a second, though.
Okay.
We beat the C96 in terms of mag loading. The C96 is another gun that has a complicated thing where we kind of have to decock the hammer in order to carry it chamber ready.
Right.
So you have to draw it, change the safety position, and recock the hammer.
Yep.
So the C96 has that same sort of problem, although you can do it with a human hand.
Right, and it's right here on the left side of the frame, so I'm able to get going with it.
So would you say this is slightly worse than the C96 is?
Yeah, it technically is.
Okay. The question is, how much does it break it for you? Because now you're left carrying it either cocked with the safety down, or you're carrying it decocked with the safety down. Which is one or two hand motions, both of which are very difficult for you.
I mean, that's not great, but if I were to think of it just in terms of, realistically, that's not going to be the problem that'll break it. It'll be how it takes the round. So magazine versus stripper clip. Magazine's going to win almost every day.
But that's only your follow-up shots. Your first shot is the most critical.
That's true, because technically this wouldn't be your main arm. This would be
it's in your holster.
Yeah.
There's bad dudes around. You draw, and then fart around for 5 minutes, and then shoot them. That's not good.
No.
So I think you end up having... Honestly, it is much smarter to carry this gun chamber empty. Because then you can leave the magazine in there, nothing in the chamber.
And you can leave the
let the
safety
hammer
off,
down.
and then that way all you have to do is just rack the slide, good to go.
Right. But then you have to rack your slide.
That's still more to it then. So that's not good. That's putting it below that.
You now see the logic in why Ordnance ended up in this position where they kept saying it takes 2 hands to ready the gun. It doesn't take 2 hands to ready the gun if you have it chambered.
Right.
But the way the safety's set up, they're like, they don't even want to count chambering it as a thing. They're saying, no, I'm going to carry it unchambered because it's ridiculous to try to go through any of this other motion. Because as much as you might be upset about the 2-handed chambering, it's faster than 2 or 1-handed readying of the safety system.
Oh, yeah, hands down.
Yeah.
So that's not great. It's kind of making it look not good, but it's still passable.
First shot counts. A lot.
Yeah.
So maybe like the softest yes?
Kind of, unfortunately. Just because of that first round count, if we try to think of it from that perspective.
Yeah, it's one of those, like, you'd have to get it ready right before you go in the fight and then really worry about maybe not tripping that trigger.
There's so much potential here. That's the thing, is that you can see where the improvements are needed.
Oh, it is
pretty critically.
Tiny changes away from being a fully modern handgun.
Exactly. It's like right there on the cusp of it.
Yeah, and if you look at the contemporaries, it's smoking the competition in terms of its core concepts. I mean, to this day, slide operation is standard.
Well, it's like when we thought of the Luger. We just saw where, like, you start with the 1900, you can see just some base little minor improvements needed to make it into, like, the P08.
Right.
That's pretty rad.
Well, where's the Luger today, though? Yeah. Like, at this moment in 1900, I think the Luger 1900 is a better gun than this one. But boy, once you put a little extra sauce on there, it just completely redefines the handgun.
Makes it sing.
Yeah.
And this needs a little bit of Cholula. Just a little bit. Needs to be a little spicier.
Well, of course we see the potential because this is the grandpappy, not only to the 1911, but really to all slide-operated handguns in the modern context.
Right, so this is our starting point.
Yeah, this is an origin for many, many guns.
Kind of cool.
Yeah. Thanks again to Manticore Arms for loaning this to us.
Yes, thank you guys. We appreciate it. We were able to get this path started because of them.
So, any other final thoughts on the 1900?
Overall, I'm actually quite excited to be able to try this because I feel like going through the progression of the guns, it was critical to be able to try this first, I think, in order to be able to actually do a really good comparison and growth for later on what's going to come.
Yeah, it's also a really clear sign that things come in stages, that really good invention is not just everything's perfect. And even though Browning designed this system so well and picked the right thing, obviously, because it goes forward, this is still a twin-link gun. It's still, even in its current form, it's got a lot of little engineering tweaks from Colt themselves and their engineers. It's not Browning alone. So it's important to remember, these guns are not just sort of manifested from thoughts from genius people.
No.
These come from...
a culmination.
Well, they come from curiosity, investigation, and then a lot of hard work and trial and error.
Trial and error, man.
So many metal shavings.
Yep.
And it's a really good life lesson, I think, in a lot of ways. And we really tend to just be like, oh, so-and-so made it at this date. No, there's a lot of work. And actually, we're going to talk about how much work it takes to make one of these in a little special feature sometime in the future.
Ooh, fancy.
All right, well, with that wrapped up, stay tuned after the credits for any updates. And otherwise, you guys have a good one.
Bye, everybody. Update time. For those of you who participated in this year's Indiegogo campaign, shirts are making their way out the door. Some have already been received, so keep your eyes up. We appreciate y'all supporting the campaign. Without this and our consistent patrons, this in-depth history show would not be possible. So thank you all. For those of you who can't donate, sharing the show and spreading our love for history is also important. The more people we reach, the more opportunities and growth we gain. We have been told we've been made a part of some Family Tuesday movie nights. Thank you again, everyone, for the support, and we hope you all enjoyed what is the beginning to our Colt 1911 series.